If there's one thing Simone Baker was sure of, after 32 years of living, it's this. There's no such thing as walking normally when you're a black woman carrying a backpack in a public place in America. Especially at Union Station on a Monday morning, where people are in a rush, coffee spills, and the scrutinizing eyes always arrive before the greetings. Simone is a high school history and social studies teacher, someone who has the habit of arriving at least half an hour before her train departs, not because she hates being late, but because she hates the feeling of having to run in a world that never runs in the same direction as her. This morning, she wore a white shirt, dress pants, her hair neatly tied up, and glasses looking like a more polished version of herself, almost as if she were the perfect black person in society's eyes. But experience had taught her that no matter how you dress, you can still be seen as a threat, as long as you're the wrong color. Pulling her suitcase and holding the backpack with the Teachers for Justice sticker, Simone walked through the automatic turnstile, sunlight streaming through the skylight onto her cheek. The overhead announcement rang out in the distance. Train number 26 to Springfield will depart at 8:15. Passengers, please proceed to gate 9. She sighed lightly and reassured herself, everything will be fine. Today is just a normal day. But there's one thing. Her normal was about to be shattered. Not because of a technical issue, not because the train was late, but by a man in a blue uniform, a soul full of prejudice, and a dream he had never fulfilled. To become a superhero by stopping a black woman from reading a book. And that's when Officer Doug Mallory stepped into the story, with a Dunkin' coffee in hand, a dramatic attitude straight out of an action movie, and an unnatural intuition that no one asked for. The train hadn't even left yet, but the confrontation had silently begun between a teacher carrying ideals and a cop carrying prejudice. Officer Doug Mallory, who had self-appointed himself as the guardian of absolute order at Union Station, wasn't the kind of cop who would resort to physical force. No, Doug attacked with his eyes, the kind of gaze that seemed to see through a person's skin, as if he were trying to uncover a potential crime between 2 sandwiches and a Toni Morrison book. Doug spotted Simone from afar. She was sitting on a bench, wearing headphones and reading a book, The Bluest Eye. For Doug, who hadn't been inside a library since the closest he got, was a cat calendar stand at Walmart. A black person sitting quietly reading a book was suspicious. He walked over, took a sip of his coffee, and frowned as if the smell of espresso had just revealed a national security plot. His right hand reached for the radio, while his left hovered near his belt where the baton was slightly visible. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a forced politeness. "Are you waiting for the train?" Simone looked up, took out her headphones. "Yes, Springfield. 8:15, gate 9. Doug nodded and then tilted his head. "I noticed you've been sitting here for a while. No visible luggage. Are you here alone?" Simone blinked. "Does the suitcase 3 inches from me not count?" Doug ignored her. "What's in your backpack?" Simone looked up again, flashing a smile that seemed to say, "You really want to go there?" Before opening her backpack, Doug looked inside and saw a cold chicken sandwich, a box of colored pencils, a teaching notebook, and a teacher's ID card. Oh, and of course, the new Jim Crow at the bottom. Terrible. Doug raised an eyebrow. "What do you do for a living?" Simone replied calmly, "I teach history about the mass incarceration system and racial discrimination at a public high school." Doug stood straight, his shoulders stiff, as if the word race had just terrified him. Interesting," he murmured, his voice dropping as if assessing a threat from a pen. "We're trained to be alert for suspicious behavior." I hope you understand." Simone smiled, closing her book and speaking gently like the spring breeze. "The thing is, what you see as suspicious sometimes is just a black person living their life normally." Doug didn't say anything, but his gaze spoke volumes. He wasn't used to being explained to, especially by someone he had always assumed wasn't supposed to know better. And then, the train whistle blew. But in that brief moment, as Simone stood up and pulled her suitcase toward the gate, while Doug stayed behind with his hand still resting near his baton, one thing was clear. The battle had only just begun. Simone walked, her posture straight, as if each step was a gentle yet undeniable statement. On her shoulder, her backpack swayed in rhythm, like a reminder that she had nothing but books and dignity. And perhaps that was what made Doug feel even more uneasy. He didn't call for backup. He didn't yell out like in low-budget action movies. Instead, he quietly followed her. For Doug, a black person walking without hurrying, without lowering their head, and without avoiding the gaze of power, was something unusual. The train was 12 minutes late, as usual at Union Station. Simone waited near Gate 9, finishing the last chapter of her book. Doug stood not far away, his hand lightly resting on the radio strap, as if just one key word could turn the peaceful atmosphere into an emergency alert. A station employee approached Simone, holding a ticket-checking device. She handed her ticket over, smiling. The exchange was normal, except for Doug's unblinking stare from behind. But then, a small action broke everything. Simone pulled out her phone and turned on the video camera. Doug flinched. "What are you filming?" He approached, his voice raised. Simone didn't rush to respond. She pointed the camera at herself and spoke in a calm, small voice, like she was giving a lecture. "I'm recording my experience here at Union Station, where reading a book can be considered suspicious behavior if you don't have the right skin color." A few passengers around started to pay attention. Some looked up from their phones. An elderly woman whispered to her husband, "Not again." Doug was flustered. He had never been filmed while simply doing his job. He had never been the subject of a video that could easily be tagged with hashtags like "breathing wrong" or "what's wrong with reading." "You're misunderstanding me," he said, his voice beginning to waver. "I'm just following protocol." Simone smiled softly, not the sarcastic smile, but the kind of sad smile of someone who has heard that same phrase all their life. "And that protocol," she continued gently, "seems to apply only to a certain group of people. Doesn't it, officer?" Doug opened his mouth, but no words came out. Only the sound of the train whistle blaring for the second time, loud, prolonged, as if the system itself was acknowledging what people still denied. Doug stood there, trying to hold on to whatever authority he had left, but the train whistle seemed to expose everything. The passengers began to murmur, not loudly, not rebelliously, just looks. There was something in their gazes that made Doug feel like he was being watched, something he wasn't used to. Simone kept her camera up, the light from the screen reflecting on her calm face. She didn't shout, she didn't blame, no accusations. Just that one question, the question that seemed so harmless but shook the system to its core. Why does a black woman waiting for a train need to be surveilled? Doug swallowed. He could easily give orders. He could make up some excuse about security. But he knew this time it wouldn't be that simple. A woman of color, in the crowd, filming, with evidence, and worse, with clarity. "You can't film me without consent," Doug stammered. But immediately he realized that wasn't true. Passengers around started pulling out their phones. No one said anything, but clearly they had chosen a side. An Asian teenager pulled out his earphones, whispering to his girlfriend, another empty display of power. A middle-aged white man sitting nearby nodded silently. Doug turned his head, searching for a reasonable way out of this situation, but there was no way out anymore. All the eyes, all the cameras, were now on him, and Simone stood there silently, as if she were merely a narrator in a play that the audience was starting to see the truth of. "I'm not against you, officer," Simone said gently. "I just don't accept being seen as the problem." Doug paused. Those words didn't burn with anger, nor did they carry hatred. But they were as heavy as a sledgehammer, because they were true. And then, something unexpected happened. An elderly white woman, silver hair, wearing an olive-green coat, walked up and stood beside Simone. She said nothing, just nodded. Then a middle-aged Latino man stood next to her. Then a curly-haired student wearing glasses. In just a few seconds, Doug realized he wasn't the only one in uniform. Right here, right now, Simone was wearing a uniform too, one of solidarity. And that was something he hadn't been trained to deal with. Doug was used to people lowering their heads, to the silent agreement, to the averted gazes, but this time, no one was looking away. Those gazes weren't challenging. They weren't angry. They were something worse. They were awakening. Simone stood still, her hand still holding the camera, unshaken. But she was no longer a lone black woman stopped in the middle of the station. She had become a symbol of something that had been smoldering for far too long, and now it was too obvious to ignore. A woman standing near Doug, holding a Whole Foods bag, spoke gently. "Are you going to check all our bags, officer? Or just the ones that look like hers?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it resonated. A middle-class, white woman, the last person Doug expected to say that, saying it, in the middle of the crowd. The collapse didn't begin with an explosion. It started with the right question, at the right moment. Doug, like someone who had just pulled down the stage curtain, realized that the audience no longer wanted to see the same old play. He tried to regain his composure, taking a deep breath as if to reassert control. "Safety is my responsibility. I have the right to ask anyone if Simone cut him off, not with a loud voice, but with a direct one. You have the right, yes, but I have the right to live without being seen as a threat just because of my skin color." Her words were like a needle piercing through the armor of badges and authority. Skin color. Those two words, when spoken not with anger but with deep exhaustion, carried a weight that couldn't be refuted. The next silence in the station wasn't out of fear. It was out of thought. Doug looked around. The crowd wasn't just observing. They were evaluating. Not him, but the system he represented. He felt it in the way a 9-year-old Asian child pulled his mother's hand, whispering, "Mom, is that man wrong?" And the mother, no lecture, no scolding, simply replied, "No one should be stopped just because they don't look like you." Doug turned away, as if avoiding an invisible punch, but it had already landed, not in the face, but somewhere deeper in the confidence. The confidence that he was always right. His feet took a small step back, and that this was the first moment that the balance began to shift. Doug Carter, an officer who had walked through countless shifts without questioning anything, was now standing still in an invisible circle where every glance acted as a mirror, reflecting something he had never imagined he would face: himself. No one shouted. No one yelled. And it was this silence that rang louder than any alarm, An elderly woman with silver hair gently placed her hand on Simone's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Simone nodded, her eyes still locked on Doug. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. It was the calm of someone who had become all too familiar with this feeling. But this time, she wasn't alone. Doug was about to say something, maybe an explanation, or worse, an apology left hanging in the air. But his mouth was dry, and his words, usually weapons to control the situation, now betrayed him. Behind, a brown-skinned student pulled out his phone, live streaming, over 3,000 people watching. Doug heard every word, like the ticking of a countdown in his head. A middle-aged white man, still in his office shirt, with an economic conference badge on, walked up to Simone. "I stand with you. This is wrong, and I will file a complaint." One white man. Doug wasn't stupid. He knew his system operated on a delicate balance between power and the consent of the majority. And when someone like him, someone who spoke formally, began to tip the scale, everything started to slide. Doug swallowed hard, turned away. Not because he thought he was wrong, not yet, but because, for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, his power wasn't guaranteed anymore. He took a step back. Not big, but for Simone, and for those who have lived too long in the shadow of prejudice, that was a step of history. A step they had never witnessed from a police officer before. And it was a step that made Doug, the one who had never been forced to step back, feel for the first time in his life that he didn't know where to place his next foot. Simone didn't take her eyes off Doug. But instead of walking away as many expected, she stood still and did something no one expected. She laughed. Not in mockery, not in anger, but with a soft, slow laugh, as if witnessing a farce whose ending she had known all along. "You know, Officer Carter," Simone said, her voice loud enough for everyone around to hear, "I'm not angry. I'm tired." Doug furrowed his brow, as if that statement was too simple to understand. But Simone continued, "I'm tired of having to explain that my hair isn't a weapon. I'm tired of having to prove that my skin doesn't equate to guilt. And I'm tired, so tired, of having to reteach a system that I didn't create." She turned to look at a young girl holding her mother's hand, then bent down and smiled at her. "But you see, today I'm not alone, and you won't be either. Not anymore." The atmosphere shifted not suddenly, but layer by layer, like small ripples that suddenly surged into a tidal wave. A white woman, wearing a blazer and carrying a briefcase, stepped forward. "My name is Rachel. I've recorded everything, and I will submit this video to the Department of Internal Affairs." An elderly Asian man standing nearby softly said, "I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. This is the first time I've seen someone stand firm in front of a badge and not back down." The sound of camera shutters echoed like a drumbeat. The story, no longer just Simone's story, had become a story of a community. Doug turned away. No one stopped him. No one touched him. But with every step he took, he carried something he never thought he would lose: the silence of the crowd's support. And when the train doors closed behind Simone, everyone around her suddenly began clapping. Not loudly, not raucously, just a unified clap like a whisper. "We see you, and this time we stand with you." That's how justice sometimes begins. Not with a court trial, not with an investigation, but with a small laugh, and a community no longer willing to keep their eyes shut. 3 days after the incident at Marigold Station, The clip of Officer Doug Carter yelling and aggressively confronting a black woman, Simone Hayes, had surpassed the city's borders. Without needing special visual effects or dramatic narration, that short 2-minute and 13-second video sparked a long brewing debate. And this time, it couldn't be silenced with a rushed press release. The police department issued a bland statement. "We are reviewing the incident." The City Hall dodged the issue by stating, "No comment on ongoing investigations." But no one paid attention to those words anymore. What people heard were the echoes of the images. What people remembered was a girl with braided hair, holding a book, standing tall, and silently laughing as if speaking for thousands of people who had been deemed disruptive just for existing the way they were. At a coffee shop near the train station, a group of law students were discussing passionately, "We should start a community legal response group. Someone has to be ready when something like this happens again." "We? You plan to wait for the next time?" "This happens every day." Simone was just the first one to make it impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, in an internal meeting, the head of the police department's discipline division, who had dismissed 3 complaints against Carter for lack of evidence, was flipping through his file. He stared at the color photo. 1 second, then 2. Then he murmured, almost confessing, "We've let him go too far." As for Doug Carter, he was no longer patrolling. Temporarily reassigned, he spent his days sitting in a closed office, answering emails from the internal investigation team. When he walked down the hallway, the usual nods from colleagues turned into hesitant glances, as if waiting for an earthquake or an irreversible event. And in another part of the city, Simone Hayes was sitting in a small recording room. She wasn't an activist. She wasn't a lawyer. Just a woman who had been pulled off a train for not looking like everyone else. But today, she was giving an interview, calm as she had been when she smiled at Doug. "Not everyone has the privilege to stand still and be called innocent," she said. "I'm just standing. And for some, that's already too much." She looked at the camera, smiling not because she was tired, but because she knew. The game had begun, and the ground beneath those who thought they were unshakable was beginning to crack. A week after the incident at Marigold Station, the city still hadn't found common ground, but Simone had found her microphone. On a Thursday afternoon, the Little Elm Community Hall was packed. Not because there was a famous singer performing, but because a senior journalism student, who had been ignored during an internship at a local news outlet, sent Simone a blunt invitation. "You don't need to speak perfectly. You just need to tell what happened. The rest, we'll listen." Simone stood on a small wooden podium behind a simple white banner that read, "We have the right to exist without being suspected." In front of her were over 200 people. Some wore suits, others wore hoodies. There were lawyers, teachers, high school students, and even those who had been pulled off trains with no one filming it. They weren't there to be moved. They were there to confirm. This was no longer an isolated incident. Simone spoke slowly, not reading from a paper. No tear-jerking music effects, just telling her story straightforward, clear, and incredibly hard to refute. I stood. I waited for the train, just like everyone else. And then I became suspicious. When I asked why, I was told to cooperate quickly. When I smiled, they said I was challenging the law. But if the law trembles in front of a smile, maybe the problem isn't with me. Applause rang out from the farthest corners of the room, but Simone didn't stop to soak it in. She looked straight at the camera live streaming in the middle of the aisle. "I don't hate the police. I hate the system that made a man think power allowed him to invade without reason, and then call it standard procedure. And I won't stay silent just to make others feel comfortable. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, Doug Carter sat in a closed hearing room, facing 3 lawyers and 2 members of the Ethics Oversight Board. He still wore his uniform, but for the first time, the nameplate on his chest no longer made anyone step aside. One of the lawyers placed a file on the table, pulled out a photo from the original video clip. The frame captured exactly the moment Carter's hand touched Simone's neck as she was gripping her book. The photo was zoomed in, the edges highlighted, as if someone had outlined it with a highlighter. Do you know why we chose this moment? Carter swallowed hard, silent. Because in just one frame, we see more than 1,000 internal reports. This is no longer a mistake. This is power being abused, shielded by the silence that's been lasting for years. Outside, in the comment section of the live stream, thousands of people began to mention a phrase, #stand with Simone. No one knew if that hashtag could change a policy or get Carter removed from his position. But they knew one thing: Simone did not back down. And from that moment on, no one could look at a black person standing at a train station without thinking of the question, are they standing in the wrong place again today? When the hearing ended, Doug Carter stepped out of the administration building, no longer with the badge on his chest, no longer receiving wary glances from the public, only wary glances from his former colleagues. There were no sirens, no television cameras pointed at his face. Just a late afternoon in Denver, where the sunset slid through the tall windows as if making room for something new. On the other side of the city, Simone sat in a small cafe near Marigold Station. In front of her was a cup of tea. Beside it, a book not pulled from her hands, not suspected. For the first time in weeks, she breathed evenly. An elderly woman sat at the table next to hers, her face familiar. Perhaps someone who had witnessed the incident that day turned to her and spoke softly. "Young lady, I don't know you, but thank you for not staying silent like so many of us have." Simone just smiled and nodded, not out of shame, but because she knew that this thank you wasn't just for her. It was for everyone who had stood in the wrong place, who had spoken out at the right moment, who had refused to remain silent. The next day, Denver's Public Transportation Department posted a small update on the official website. It wasn't a grand announcement, nor was it printed as a banner hanging across the station. It was just a short but weighty paragraph. From now on, all law enforcement personnel within the subway system will undergo mandatory training on racial bias, civil rights, and nonviolent intervention. No exceptions. There were no celebrations, no fireworks. But at the Marigold Station information desk, a small wooden sign was hung up with a handwritten message in black ink. "We learn from our mistakes. Thank you for pointing it out." Simone went home that evening, walking past the same train station where everything had started. She didn't look back. It wasn't necessary. Because now, if someone else stood there, a girl, an elderly woman, a young man, at least people would think twice before considering them dangerous for their silence. And perhaps, thanks to a black girl who refused to stand still, the city is now learning how to stand in the right place. If you're still here, thank you. Not for watching a story, but for taking this journey with characters who seemed so small, but made an entire system bow its head and reconsider. And if one day you see someone being pulled from a crowd just because of their skin color, their voice, or their silence, don't turn away. Don't stay silent. Don't forget Simone.